Minus 41 degrees, that's the number on the thermometer nailed outside a sheet of curved steel. In the middle of the Alaskan wilderness. Inside, a man lies perfectly still, listening not to silence, to the sound of his own breath, freezing the second it leaves his mouth. Something woke him, a creak, a groan of metal contracting in cold, so deep it makes steel scream. He doesn't move. He's done the math before, more than once. At this temperature, a mistake doesn't just hurt you, it archives you in under an hour. Out here, there's no ambulance coming, no neighbor banging on the door to check if he's still breathing. Just him in the dark, and a structure he built with his own 2 hands now groaning under stress he can't see. And tonight, lying in the dark, he isn't sure if the structure around him is settling or failing. This is a home he built for $500, with nothing but scrap and stubbornness. Tonight, it's about to be tested. 3 years ago, none of this existed. He had a job. He had an apartment with drywall and a thermostat, and a landlord who raised the rent every spring like clockwork. He had a heating bill that hit $680 in a single January, and a power company that didn't care whether he could afford it or not. He paid it. Then he paid it again. Then one night, staring at a stack of bills on a kitchen table he never even liked, something in him simply stopped. He didn't quit in a dramatic blaze. He just stopped renewing, stopped paying, sold what he could, packed what mattered, and drove north, into country where the trees stand taller than buildings and the silence carries real weight. He had $500 left to his name, no mortgage, no landlord, no safety net, just a tank of gas, an old truck, and a decision most people would call insane. The plan was simple to say and brutal to execute. Build a home that owed nothing to anyone, in a place where the air itself tries to kill you for half the year. No wood-frame cabin, no drywall, no bank loan disguised as a tiny house. Just steel, scavenge, and stubbornness. He found it on a decommissioned industrial lot 2 hours from the nearest town, a rusted Quonset hut, the kind built to survive artillery fire and Arctic winters during wartime. Curved steel, corrugated, built low and arched so snow slides off instead of piling up and crushing a flat roof. Most people would see scrap. He saw a skeleton that already understood how to survive winter better than any wood frame ever could. The owner wanted it gone. Hauling it away was cheaper than scrapping it. He paid almost nothing for the shell itself. The real cost was never the structure. It was turning 30-year-old rusted steel into something that wouldn't kill him the first time the temperature dropped below zero. The first problem hit before he even got it onto his land. How do you move something the size of a small barn without a flatbed truck and a $4,000 moving crew? He didn't have either. What he had was patience, a salvaged axle assembly from a junk trailer, and a welder borrowed from a man who hadn't touched it in years. For wheels under a structure built for sitting still. It took 9 days of grinding, welding, and failing before that hut finally rolled instead of sat. The first attempt collapsed under its own weight halfway through the first test pull, the axle bending under stress it was never designed to handle alone. He reinforced it with cross braces cut from old fence posts, tested it again, and watched it hold. Mobile meant something else too. No permits, no zoning fights, no county official showing up to tell him his home didn't belong. If it has wheels, technically it's a vehicle. Nobody bothers a vehicle parked quietly in the woods. Getting it onto his land was only the beginning. A steel shell sitting in snow is not a home. It's a tin can. Without proper insulation, it would turn into a refrigerator the second the sun went down. And in Alaska, the sun goes down for most of the day in winter. This is exactly where almost every off-grid build like this fails. People focus on the shell, post the photos, and forget that steel is one of the worst materials on Earth for holding heat. It conducts cold straight through itself. Touch an uninsulated steel wall at minus 30. It will pull the warmth out of your bare hand in seconds. He couldn't afford spray foam insulation. Professional insulation alone would have eaten his entire budget twice over. So he improvised a method that costs a fraction of the price and still works if it's done correctly. Rigid foam board, salvaged from a construction dumpster 2 towns over, cut carefully to fit between the steel ribs. Behind that, a vapor barrier, thick plastic sheeting, taped at every single seam without exception. This step matters more than most people think. Skip it, and moisture from your own breath and cooking hits the cold steel, condenses, freezes, then melts again every time the stove runs. That cycle rots wood, rusts metal, and eventually soaks insulation until it's completely useless. Get the vapor barrier wrong, and you're not building a home. You're slowly building mold inside a sealed metal box. Over the foam, he layered reclaimed wool blankets and old moving pads, stuffed into every gap a richer build would have filled with materials he simply couldn't afford. It isn't elegant. It works. The temperature difference inside, even on the coldest nights, runs nearly 70 degrees warmer than the air pressing against the outside of the steel. Heat needed a real source, and this is where his first true crisis happened. The kind of moment that almost ended the entire experiment before winter had even fully arrived. He'd installed a small wood stove, salvaged and patched, with a stovepipe running straight up through the curved roof. First real cold night. First real fire. Within 20 minutes, smoke began pooling along the ceiling instead of pulling up through the pipe. No alarm, no warning beyond a thickening haze, and a headache creeping in behind his eyes. He stumbled outside into freezing air just in time, lungs burning, before the carbon monoxide could build any further. The pipe had been installed at the wrong angle, with a flat run instead of a steady upward pitch, creating a pocket where smoke and gas could stall instead of escaping. One mistake. Inside a sealed steel box, in temperatures that make stepping outside, without proper gear genuinely dangerous. He spent the next 2 days recutting the roof, repositioning the chimney, double sealing every joint with high-temperature sealant, and installing the cheapest carbon monoxide detector he could find. Non-negotiable, he says now, for anyone attempting something like this. Looking back, he calls that night the single closest he ever came to losing everything, closer even in the windstorm that nearly tore his roof apart months later. A stove inside an airtight steel shell isn't optional safety. It's the line between living through winter and never waking up at all. With heat solved, power came next, and this is the part most viewers expect to be complicated. It wasn't not really. It just required accepting less. A single solar panel, salvaged and slightly cracked, but still functional, mounted on the curved roof at an angle steep enough to shed snow instead of burying itself under it, wired to a deep cycle battery scavenged from a junk truck. No grid, no bill, no company that can shut anything off if he's late on a payment. It doesn't run much. A string of LED lights, a small radio, just enough to charge a phone when needed. That's the trade. Total independence means total simplicity. No washing machine, no refrigerator humming quietly in the corner, just enough light to read by, and enough power to stay reachable if something truly goes wrong. Water was the most physically brutal part of daily life, and the part viewers always underestimate most. There's no faucet, no tank truck delivery out here. Just snow, melted over wood stove in a blackened pot, morning and night, every single day without exception. It takes far longer than people assume to melt enough snow for drinking, cooking, and basic hygiene. Roughly 2 hours a day, total, just to keep enough water on hand for the basics. Time that, in his old life, he never once had to think about. It's tedious. It's also the one chore that, more than any other, reminds him daily exactly what he gave up and exactly what he gained instead. Food was never part of the original plan, and it became one of the hardest lessons he had to learn entirely on his own. In town, food had been a 5-minute errand. Out here, it became a calculation involving weight calories, and the brutal truth that nothing spoils slowly when the air outside is colder than most freezers. He built a simple cold storage box from scrap plywood, lined with the same foam board he used on the walls, buried half into a snowbank against the north side of the hut. No electricity needed. The cold itself becomes a refrigerator, as long as you understand how to use it instead of fighting it. Meat, when he has it, lasts for weeks without a single watt of power. Vegetables freeze solid and lose almost nothing in the process. He learned to plan meals not around taste, but around what wouldn't kill and prepare after dark and temperatures that punish exposed skin within minutes. Isolation hit him in a way the cold never did. There were nights, especially early on, when the silence outside felt less like peace and more like pressure. No phone calls that mattered, No faces besides his own reflection in a frosted window. He kept a small radio running off the solar battery, less for entertainment, and more as proof that the rest of the world still existed somewhere beyond the trees. He admits now that the first month nearly broke him, not physically, but mentally. There were moments he genuinely considered walking back into town and begging for his old job back, just to hear another voice in person again. Building shelter from steel turned out to be far easier than building patience with his own thoughts. His family thought he'd lost his mind. A few friends stopped calling entirely once the calls stopped being returned. The ones who did reach him by radio relay or the rare trip into town asked the same question every time. Why would anyone choose this over a warm apartment with running water and a working furnace? He never had a clean answer for them, not at first. It was easier to show them a notebook of expenses than to explain a feeling that doesn't translate well over a bad connection. Eventually, most of them stopped asking. A few, quietly, started asking how he did it instead. Snow Low became its own slow-burning, gradual danger, one that crept up gradually instead of striking all at once like the wind. The curved roof was supposed to shed snow naturally, and for the most part did. But heavy, wet snowfall in early spring behaves differently than the dry powder of midwinter. It clings. It builds. One March, after 3 days of steady snowfall, he noticed the structure groaning under weight it had never carried before. He spent an entire freezing afternoon on a makeshift ladder, clearing snow by hand with a push broom. Terrified the curved steel might buckle under load it was never tested against in this configuration. It didn't buckle. But the lesson stuck. A design built to shed snow only works if nothing interrupts the shedding, and wet spring snow interrupts everything. Maintenance became a constant, quiet companion rather than an occasional chore. Every few weeks, he checks the seam for new gaps, the chimney for buildup, the foam insulation for any sign of moisture creeping in where it shouldn't. It's not glamorous work. It rarely makes for exciting footage. But it's the unseen labor that separates a structure that survives one winter from one that survives a decade. He's come to see maintenance not as a burden, but as a price of independence, paid in small, manageable installments instead of one crushing bill at the end of the month. By the time the structure was sealed, heated, and powered, he'd spent just under $500 in actual cash. Everything else was salvage, sweat, and time he no longer had to trade for someone else's paycheck. No mortgage. No rent, no bill collector, no landlord raising the price of his own walls every spring, without warning. But none of that mattered on the night the wind finally came. It wasn't forecasted, not with any real warning. Just a pressure change in the air, the kind long-time locals learn to feel before they ever see it. By midnight, gusts strong enough to rattle every loose panel on the structure tore through the trees surrounding him. The Quonset hut, curved and aerodynamic by accident of its old military design, held its shape, but something hadn't reinforced properly. A seam along the rear wall, patched hastily weeks earlier, began to peel apart. He woke to a sound like a freight train tearing through sheet metal. A 6-inch gap had opened along the rear seam, and freezing air was pouring directly into the space where he slept, at minus 30-something. With wind chill dragging it even lower, a gap like that is an inconvenience. It's a death sentence if left untreated for more than an hour or two. There was no calling for help. No neighbor close enough to matter. Just him, a headlamp, a roll of aluminum tape that had no business working in conditions that cold, and roughly 20 minutes before the cabin's internal temperature would have dropped low enough to risk hypothermia even with the stove still burning steadily. He worked fast, hands going numb inside thin work gloves, sealing the tear from the inside first to stop the bleeding of warm air, then bracing the outside the following morning with scrap sheet metal and lag bolts driven through pre-drilled holes he should have added the very first time. It held. It's held ever since. He checks that seam now before every major storm, almost out of habit, the way someone else might check a smoke detector battery. But that night taught him something no amount of research ever could. In true cold, the margin for error isn't small. It's non-existent. Morning came, and with it, something the camera always loves and the man himself still hasn't fully gotten used to, the contrast. Outside, gray sky, dead silence, snow stretching in every direction without a single power line in sight. Inside, warm light from a single bulb, a stove crackling steadily, steam rising off a pot of melted snow slowly turning into coffee. Two completely different worlds, separated by nothing more than inches of foam board and stubbornness. He says that contrast never gets old, no matter how many winters pass. Stepping from one world into the other every single morning is the closest thing he has to proof that the work was worth it. He keeps a small notebook with every expense written by hand. The hut itself, almost free, axle and wheel salvage, roughly $90 in welding supplies and bolts. Insulation materials, under $70, most of it scavenged from dumpsters and job sites. Stove repair and chimney sealant, just over $50. Solar panel and battery, free, both pulled from things other people had already thrown away. Total real cash spent, start to finish, $483. He still has the receipts, taped into back pages, in case anyone ever doubts the number. No mortgage payment, no electric bill, no water bill, no rent, just labor, risk, and a level of self-reliance most people will never test in themselves, because most people will simply never need to. He doesn't pretend this life is easy at all. He doesn't pretend it's right for everyone. Ask him directly, and he'll tell you plainly, this isn't freedom from work. It's freedom from someone else controlling whether he eats, stays warm, or has a roof over his head at all. That distinction, small as it sounds, changes everything about how a person sleeps at night. Every log he burns, he cut himself. Every drop of water, he melted himself. Every wall keeping the cold outside, he built with his own two hands, learning the hard way exactly what failure looks like at 40 degrees below zero. What he gained isn't comfort, it's control. Nobody can raise his rent. Nobody can shut off his heat over a missed payment. Nobody owns any part of the walls around him. That single fact, he says, is worth more to him than any comfort he gave up to get it. In exchange, he accepted danger most people spend their entire lives carefully avoiding. Wind that can kill, cold that never forgives mistakes, isolation that tests a person's mind just as hard as it tests their body. For him, that trade was worth it, fully and without regret. Whether it's worth it for you is a much harder question, and one only you can answer for yourself. If there's one lesson worth carrying away from a story like this, it isn't really about steel huts or scavenged solar panels. It's about the gap between what we think we need to survive and what we actually need. Most people will never strip their life down to $500 and a steel shell in the wilderness. But almost everyone at some point faces a version of the same choice he did. Keep paying for a life that's slowly draining them, or risk everything to build something that's genuinely, finally their own. Most people choose the safer path, and there's nothing wrong with that. Safety has its own value. But every once in a while, someone decides a risk is worth it, and the rest of us get to watch what happens when they're right. He chose pure risk. 3 winters later, he's still here, still warm, still free of every single bill that used to own him. He has no plans to go back to the life he left behind, no matter how much easier it might look from a distance, and no matter how many times people ask him when he's coming home. The hardest winters taught him the most, he says, not because they nearly broke him, but because they proved again and again that he could rebuild faster than the cold could tear things down. Let me know in the comments if you found this helpful, and subscribe for more videos about how to survive cold winters.